Hello, welcome to the video. I'm going to try to cover two topics with this: meat production and genetically modified organisms. The first one is meat production, and as you can see from the graphic down here, meat production is terribly inefficient in terms of the amount of energy that goes in, and this goes back to the 10% rule that we talked about with trophic systems. And so 10% of the sun's energy gets used by the plants to grow, and of all the energy stored within the plants, 10% of that goes to the animals. And so it's really inefficient in terms of calories that we get from it versus what we have to put in from it. And so there's kind of two ways we can produce meat. We can allow them to open graze, like out in the pastures that you see when you're driving on the rural areas of the road. You'll see the cattle and the sheep and the goats out there eating and enjoying the grass and stuff that grows naturally in the pastures or in the rangelands. The feedlots are the other option. The CAFO here stands for Concentrated Animal Feed Operation, and so they're feeding a lot of animals in a small amount of space. And so these are kind of our industrialized feed operations. So controlled animal feeding operation has a couple negative side effects to it. On the good side, it uses up a very small amount of area, and you can see an example of a CAFO down here in rural North Carolina. And this is for pigs in this image. And so the pigs would live within these barns, and then all the waste from the pigs that they produce are stored in these ponds out back here called lagoons, waste lagoons. And one of the big problems with these are the production of these waste products, especially water pollutants, nitrates, and phosphates. These are the ones we talked about leading towards eutrophication. And so these lagoons will leak or seep, and what they've got here is some sort of Bermuda grass probably, and they'll actually spray these waste products, the nitrates and the phosphates from the animal waste, the feces, out onto the fields, and from there it'll run off into the water systems. It could leach down into the groundwater. So that's one of the big problems. Another big problem is the heavy use of antibiotics. When you store a lot of animals so close together, like in this picture here, you can see all these pigs in such close proximity, diseases run kind of rampant. And so they use a lot of antibiotics to battle them. The problem with using so many antibiotics is you develop antibiotic resistant diseases, and those can transfer to humans, and that's where the real concern comes from. The other problem with it is the hormones. So a lot of these pigs are given hormones, or cattle are given hormones to make them grow larger or produce more mass. Those hormones actually leave their body through their pee and can affect the environment. It can affect fish in the water. It can affect insects, a lot of different things. And so they kind of trickle down. They can even accumulate in some of those lower level organisms and get passed up the food chain, potentially to humans. Another big problem with these are the methane and ammonia production. So ammonia smells really bad. It kind of burns the nostrils to smell it. And methane is a really prevalent and a really bad greenhouse gas. And so this probably contributes about 30% of the world's methane production from these controlled operated feedlots. Another big problem here are the pathogens produced. So because they're in close proximity, it generates some pathogens, and not just within the pigs themselves, but these waste lagoons in the back are very good breeding grounds for a certain type of bacteria that can wreak a lot of havoc. And so those can get spread easily. What you're seeing here is a aerial photograph of a similar farm, not the exact same one, but a similar farm that in 1999, Hurricane Floyd flooded their lagoons, and you can see the brown animal manure spread all over the land. And so on one hand, this is a terrible environmental disaster because all of these bad things have escaped and gotten out into the environment. For the pig farmers, though, this was a great thing because it got rid of all of their waste, and they weren't really liable for letting it get lost because the hurricane did it. So the breeding grounds for Pfiesteria piscida are in these lagoons. And so in 1995, in North Carolina, there's a river called New River that experienced the worst spill disaster in American history. And so it spilled and it ruptured and let out 25.8 million gallons, which is double what was spilled by the Exxon Valdez oil leak in Alaska. just to give you an idea on how much fluid. And it was said that it was so dense. Remember, this is the waste from the animals, and it could contain things like their feces, but also skin, hair, bones of the carcasses, pretty much all the nasty gook from the pigs into the river. It was so dense that it took 2 months for it to travel 16 miles to the ocean. So it just kind of slowly slogged along down the creek, and it killed everything that it encountered. And so this was a pretty big outbreak. And the reason why it killed so much aquatic life is because this Pfiesteria posida, this dinoflagellate, was in the water, and it is a pretty toxic thing. If you want to read up on it on Wikipedia, you're welcome to. So some solutions to it. How can we improve the meat problem that we've got? And so one of the big solutions, this is probably the biggest one, is to switch from these less grain efficient meats to ones that are more grain efficient. So if we shift our diet from being high in pork and beef into something that's more chicken based, chickens are much more efficient at turning grain to meat. Especially modern day chickens are really large, really plump animals, and so they have a lot of meat to them. That's one way we can reduce. The reason why this works is because it takes less inputs to grow the chickens than the beef and the pork. They produce less of the greenhouse gases, they produce less waste, so it's environmentally better. We can also shift from our controlled animal feed operations into production on range lands and grasslands. So kind of go back to the pastures with the animals. What this does is it kind of spreads out that animal waste. Instead of pumping it off the floor into these lagoons, it kind of gets spread out evenly over the rangelands. And as we talked about with soil, it kind of naturally fertilizes and gives it this nice, over time, organic compost to replenish the nutrients in the soil. And so it kind of keeps that cycle going nicely. Another solution here is to feed them roughage. Roughage is a term for like the stalks and parts of plants that we don't eat. So it might be like the stalks of corn plants, or like the husks of corn plants. So essentially we're feeding them things that we're already growing but not using. And so rather than burning fresh fossil fuels to farm grains specifically only to feed livestock, now we're growing food for ourselves, and the parts we can't use we're giving to the animals, the cows and the pigs that we also want to eat. And then the final one is to simply just eat less meat. And a big American tradition is kind of have meat at every single meal, and that is really not sustainable. If everybody ate meat at every meal, there would only be enough food in the world to feed about 2.5 billion people, and that would leave a lot of people out in the cold there. So it's not, a meat eater's diet is not sustainable due to the amount of inputs of these grains that it takes to grow the meat. And so simply by eating less meat, maybe once or twice a week is what you have meat, or once a day rather than 3 times a day, doing every little part can help. Aquaculture is kind of our solution to overfishing. So commercial fisheries are usually obtained by going out fishing. They could use nets, they could use long lines, rod and reels. There's a lot of different ways to go commercial fishing, but it leads to one big problem, and that's the tragedy of commons, the overfishing. And so a lot of our fish stocks have been depleted or are being depleted. And one solution to that is the aquaculture. And so aquaculture, we're going to farm the fish in aquatic habitats. We can use a very small amount of area to grow a lot of these fish, and we can use flowing water to bring food and remove waste. And so there's a couple different ways we can set up aquaculture. This one here is kind of like these suspended columns along our oceanic wind farms. You're kind of killing 2 birds with 1 stone. The structure comes from the wind farm, and then you can grow around them. More commonly, what you see are these holding pens, these coastal pens, and so these ones would lie near shore, and it would be accessible by boats, and they would bring their boats out here and do whatever kind of maintenance needed doing, or harvest the fish when it's time to harvest the fish. But there's an automatic feeder, and so they essentially just kind of are anchored in place, and the fish get fed, and everyone's happy, and we go out and harvest them when we want them. There's a couple other ones. This one's real fancy. It's a underwater one, so it's deep ocean, and it's just kind of open ocean. There's a lot of space out there, and it's got some thrusters on it, and it'll actually move around with the current to keep the fish in ideal water temperatures. And essentially the idea is you can set them, send them out to sea, and then schedule them to come back whenever you want them back. And when they come back, they'll have a giant ball full of fish at the bottom, which is kind of cool. and then we can also grow them onshore. And so this one helps eliminate some problems that these ones don't. Namely, you don't have to worry about the fish escaping out into the environment and getting away. Here they land on the ground, and it's okay, they're on the ground, they die. Some of the risks to these marine aquaculture, one of them is the amount of fish that you have to feed them. So salmon, for instance, are carnivorous fish, and so you have to feed them fish or proteins. They can't eat grasses or grains, and so being higher on the food chain, they require more of an input and energy. You also could potentially introduce non-natives if you're growing salmon in an area where salmon aren't prevalent and the salmon escape and get away. Now you've brought an invasive species with you. The drugs, antibiotics, those types of things, if you're putting them into the water with the fish, they're also going straight out of the water. The net's not going to keep those things in, and you're getting them into the local environment. And then the last real big one here is the fish sewage at the bottom. So if this is a locked or an anchored tank, all the waste from the fish is going to fall straight down and just kind of pile up on the ground beneath it. Which is not a good thing, because you then have all this extra waste on the bottom of the ocean there. It can cause eutrophication, dead zones, that kind of stuff. And that's where we'll stop for this one. I'll keep it a little bit shorter. Thanks for watching. Please bring some notes and be ready to discuss the 2 different ways of meat production tomorrow in class. Thanks for watching.